In the year 1863, Northern Virginia was a hell of fire and blood that could be felt in every corner of the barren, devastated landscape. The American Civil War claimed its victims daily, hundreds of them, thousands of them, men who fell without even understanding why they were dying. In the Union field camps hung this pessimism in the air like the dust that the wind stirred up every morning, as if defeat were already written in the sands of time. The soldiers moved slowly, powerlessly, their uniforms torn and dirty, their faces burned by the merciless sun of the region. In this moment, amidst this chaos and desperation that seemed to have no end, appeared the Gravedigger, an old mule that looked as if it had been pulled from a grave several centuries ago. The Confederate soldiers had left behind a pile of starving animals during their hasty retreat from their positions, abandoning them to their fate in the inhospitable landscape. This poor creature, this mule that bore the nickname the Gravedigger, miraculously survived against all odds, feeding on what it found, drinking water from rotting puddles and performing acts of resistance that challenged human understanding. Her gray coat was completely disheveled, with tufts of hair that had fallen out here and there, exposing the bare skin underneath. Her ribs were so clearly visible that she literally looked like a skeleton covered only with wet rags and desert dust. When she walked, every bone in her body seemed to creak with movement. One eye was completely clouded by cataracts, so dense that it looked like an opaque glass ball, completely useless for any visual function. The other eye could barely see what lay before it, barely distinguishing between shadows and light. But still she continued. Still she lived on. Her gait was extremely slow, almost paused, as if each step cost her life, as if she were saying goodbye to the world with each movement. The experienced Union soldiers, hardened by years of war, numbed by the suffering and death they saw daily, but not without a certain black humor that characterized the men of the front, could not suppress their laughter every time they saw the Gravedigger swaying toward them. "Oh, comrade! Is this dirty wreck our new war horse?" shouted one of the common soldiers, a fellow of barely 25 years named James, who had the habit of making fun of everything he saw. "I'll bet my boots that this animal won't even reach the campsite, it'll collapse on the way," answered another soldier named John, who worked in the kitchen and always found time for jokes. "Just look at how she walks. It seems as if death itself had taken pity on her and decided to keep her alive, but without the dignity of being able to die in peace," added a third, whose name no one remembered because he changed camps every week. The soldiers laughed and laughed, their laughter echoing throughout the entire camp, resonating in the tents, losing itself in the wind of the landscape. Their laughter was the sound of men desperately searching for something, anything, to distract them from the brutal reality they faced every day. Everyone laughed. Everyone except one. That one was Captain Thomas Williams, a young man of barely 32 years who seemed 50 from the weight of what he had experienced. His eyes were a dark brown, almost black, and had a depth that revealed they had seen too much tragedy, too much death, too much suffering in very little time. Williams had grown up on the frontier, son of a farmer who had lost everything during the first years of the war. He had watched his father die in a Confederate ambush, had seen his mother age decades in just a few months, had carried a rifle since he was barely 16 years old. But he still preserved something inside, something his comrades had lost years ago, the ability to see beyond the obvious, to seek solutions where others saw only insurmountable problems. Williams observed the Gravedigger with an intensity that was almost disturbing, with a concentration that made the other officers wonder if the captain might be losing his mind. While his fellow officers, colonels and lieutenants of higher rank, openly mocked the animal and placed bets on how many days it would live before finally collapsing, Williams saw something the others could not clearly perceive. He saw pure, raw and unshakable resistance. He saw a living being that had suffered in every conceivable way, that had been beaten by life with clenched fists, that had endured extreme hunger, terrible thirst, bone-chilling cold and burning heat, and yet there it was, breathing, moving, existing against all probability and all logic. It was as if the Gravedigger were a living symbol of what it meant to never give up, what it meant to keep going even when everything in the universe told you to surrender. William slowly approached the mule, completely ignoring the mockery of his comrades. He extended his hand, rough from years of carrying rifles and riding, and touched the animal's neck. The Gravedigger's skin was surprisingly warm, despite her skeletal appearance. The pulse beneath that skin felt strong, almost defiant, as if the mule's heart were silently screaming that it was still alive, that it still wanted to live. Williams looked into the Gravedigger's good eye, that half-clouded eye that could barely see anything, but that somehow seemed to look directly into his soul. In that moment, something changed in Captain Williams' mind. Something clicked. In the absolute chaos of battle, in the uncertainty of wartime, in this moment where everyone seemed to be losing faith, Williams had found exactly what he needed. An animal that understood what resistance meant. that knew the meaning of continuing forward no matter what it cost. The situation in the Union field camp was becoming increasingly critical and desperate, almost to the point of complete collapse. The Confederates, under the command of experienced generals and with seemingly inexhaustible resources, had perfectly sealed off all known and unknown supply routes. There was not enough food to feed thousands of hungry men who had been subsisting for days on dirty water and bread as hard as stones. There was no drinking water. The main well had been contaminated a week ago after Confederate bombardment, and what remained was a brown liquid that looked more like mud than anything else. And worst of all, what really made the difference between life and death in battle? There was no ammunition. The reserves had been quickly exhausted during the last engagements. And what remained in the depot was barely enough for a few hours of intense combat. The men were dying first of hunger, their stomachs cramping with pain to the point where they preferred to sleep all day rather than think about food. They were dying second of thirst, their mouths so parched they could barely speak, their throats as if filled with sand. And third, from enemy bullets. But without ammunition they would never reach that point. They would simply be massacred like defenseless cattle in a barn. Captain Williams participated in strategy meetings that took place in General Miller's tent, where the air was so thick with despair that you could touch defeat with your hands. General after general stepped before the revolutionary leader with the same depressing news, the same words that seemed laden with poison. "Sir General," said one after another, their voices broken by fatigue and hopelessness, "we have lost the game. The Confederates have surrounded us like wolves surrounding a flock of defenseless sheep. We cannot fight like this. We cannot live like this." Some even suggested capitulation, although they knew exactly what that meant: mass executions, contempt from the enemy, the erasure of their dignity as Union soldiers. Miller, that legendary commander whose name alone was enough to tie his enemies' stomachs in knots, whose reputation was built on practically suicidal acts of bravery, also began to show signs that hope was leaving him. His eyes, which normally shone with the determination of a man who believed in his cause, began to cloud over. His jaw, which was always tense with resolve, now seemed relaxed. Defeated. His army was only 60 miles away. In Boston. That city that should be his fortress. His stronghold. His refuge. But that distance might as well have been the Atlantic, so impossible did it seem to cross. The Confederates patrolled every inch of the intervening terrain. They had guards in the mountains. They had mounted scouts constantly riding around. There was not a single corner of the landscape between the besieged camp and Boston that was not under constant surveillance. Any movement east, toward Boston, would be discovered almost immediately. Williams knew, because he had heard other officers in private conversations while they drank inferior whiskey at night, that they had hidden ammunition and medicine in a secret depot near Boston. He knew because he had personally participated in the strategic talks where it had been decided to split the supplies between two locations, so that if one depot fell into enemy hands, the other could maintain the fight. He knew that these supplies, if they arrived in time, could nourish the men enough to fill their cartridge belts. They could cure the infections that made the men delirious with fever at night. They could provide one last, desperate opportunity for a frontal assault that might, just might, break the Confederate siege. It was such a fragile possibility, so dependent on 100 things that had to go perfectly, that it seemed almost ridiculous. But it was the only possibility they had. The higher-ranking military men, the generals and colonels with their worn but still impressive uniforms, had completely dismissed the idea of trying to reach Boston to get those supplies. They had discussed it, they had analyzed it, and they had concluded that it was impossible. "It's absolute suicide," Colonel Fisher had declared during one of those meetings where the tension was so palpable that the men could barely breathe. "We would lose our best men, perhaps a dozen of our bravest and most experienced warriors, and still we wouldn't arrive. The Confederates would intercept us on the way. They would ambush us. They would massacre us. And we would still lose the supplies." It was a tactically sound assessment from the standpoint of conventional military strategy. But Williams was not one of those who gave up so easily. His mind worked differently from that of his superiors. He had studied military tactics in European books he had received years earlier, treatises by Prussian strategists who analyzed how numerically inferior forces could overcome superior forces. He had ridden through these landscapes since he was a boy. When his parents sent him to help the teamsters who transported goods from one village to another, he knew every ravine, every secret pass, every place where the terrain became impassable for most men. And more important than all of that, Williams had an intuition that his superiors, men trained in formal military academies but divorced from the reality of the landscape, simply did not possess. An intuition that told him there was a way. He had to transport 200 pounds of ammunition and medicine, 200 pounds of distilled hope in wooden crates. He had to do it at night, when French eyes were less vigilant, when fatigue put even the most alert guards into a state of semi-consciousness. And he needed an animal that was practically invisible to Confederate eyes. A mule that no one would consider a military threat, something that fit so perfectly into the landscape that it would go unnoticed even if the Confederates looked directly at it. It was then, while walking through the camp at sunset, deep in thought about the problem he faced, that he saw the Gravedigger again. She stood in a corner of the camp, consuming the last remains of dry grass next to the tent where they kept some of the less valuable equipment. Her thin body swayed slightly with each chewing movement. Her coat remained a dull gray mess, but there was something in her way of standing, something in her determination to keep living despite everything, that brought Williams to an abrupt halt. His fellow officers, seeing him standing in front of the old mule, did not miss the opportunity to mock him. "Are you seriously thinking about it?" asked Lieutenant Schmidt, laughing with the kind of laughter that comes from desperation and lack of sleep. "Are you seriously going to try it with this junk? This animal wouldn't survive 5 miles loaded. It would probably collapse in the first ravine." Others joined in the mockery, their voices forming a symphony of disbelief. But Williams did not argue. He did not try to convince them. He simply observed the Gravedigger for several minutes, watching how the animal continued to chew, continued to breathe, continued to exist despite practically every disadvantage. She had been beaten by life in ways that most men could only understand intellectually, never truly experience. And yet there she was. That was exactly what Williams needed. That night, in the solitude of his tent, illuminated by a candle that flickered constantly, Williams drew the mental maps of the route he would take. He studied every ravine, every hill, every depression in the terrain that could provide cover. He thought through in his mind each of the known locations of Confederate guard posts, trying to imagine which route the Confederates would be least likely to monitor. He reached certain conclusions, some based on solid data, others on an intuition he could not even fully explain to himself. But he had already made his decision. The Gravedigger would be his transport, she would be his ally, she would be his only and fragile hope for success. The sunset in the Virginia landscape was a thing of brutal beauty that could only be understood if you had seen it with your own eyes. The sky turned bloody orange and red, as if the universe itself were confirming the violence taking place below in that cursed dust, in that land that had drunk too much American blood. Williams worked in absolute silence together with a small group of trusted soldiers he had personally selected, men he had known for years and to whom he could extend trust that went beyond words. They loaded the mule with precision that bordered on the obsessive, as if they were assembling a Swiss timepiece in the middle of the Virginia landscape. Every pound was carefully weighed. Williams himself kept a small notebook in which he noted the weight of each crate, each bundle, making sure nothing got out of control. Each ammunition crate was secured with hemp ropes that had been soaked in water and then dried under the merciless sun to achieve greater resistance. These ropes would become hard as steel, and that was exactly what they needed. The medicines, mainly morphine from New York in dark glass bottles, were placed in the center of the load, protected from impacts. Next to them were the rudimentary antibiotics that the field doctors had made with processed herbs according to old formulas that went back to colonial healers. These medicines were more valuable than gold in these times of war and rampant disease. 2 pounds of quinine, 1 pound of experimental sulfonamides, unprocessed cotton bandages, small surgical instruments wrapped in linen cloth. Everything was packed in reinforced wooden crates. Crates that Williams had specially made so they would be resistant but not heavy. 200 pounds total. For a normal mule, that would have been truly excessive weight. Practically impossible to transport over 60 miles without the animal collapsing. But the captain knew in a way he could not even fully explain to himself that the Gravedigger was not a normal mule. This animal had suffered in ways that normal mules simply did not survive. That had transformed her into something more than flesh and bone. That had transformed her into pure will. As the night progressed and the team approached departure time, the soldiers of the Union camp began to gather around the loading site, as if it were a public execution rather than a military operation. Some simply watched in silence. Others whispered bets among themselves, their voices low but full of brutal skepticism. "She won't even reach the first dune, comrade," said a sergeant with gold teeth that gleamed in the torchlight. "I'll bet $5 that she collapses in the first 5 miles," added another, a small, stocky soldier who had survived the Battle of Gettysburg. There was a third who simply laughed, a cold laugh that echoed in the night air. "Look, the captain has gone completely mad. Now he's really lost his mind." But Williams paid no attention whatsoever to these comments. His mind was completely focused, completely absorbed in what he had to do. He had retraced in his mental memory every map of the terrain he would have to cross, every alternative route, every potential hiding place, every ravine and hill that could be used to avoid Confederate guard posts. He had imagined over and over again every point where the Confederates might keep watch, where they had cavalry outposts waiting for Union movements. He knew these landscapes like his own home, because he had spent years traversing them since his youth, when his father took him on trading trips through the North. This knowledge would now be his weapon. Williams had carefully selected the 3 soldiers who would accompany him. He didn't need an army for this mission. An army would be counterproductive, would be too visible, would be loud and cumbersome. He needed specialists. The first was Sergeant Miller, a man of 55 years with a body that seemed carved in stone, his muscles worn but still functional after decades of war. Miller was covered in scars that told stories of old battles, of close encounters where only the strongest and fastest survived. One particular scar ran from his right eye to his jaw, the result of a Confederate knife in a tavern in Chicago years ago. Miller was silent, methodical, and above all a man who never questioned an order once it was given. The second was Lieutenant Sarah, young at barely 30 years, with a slim but muscular body like that of a puma. Sarah had been born in Boston, and knew every corner of the land. She was agile, almost incredibly agile, one of those people who seemed to move without completely touching the ground. Her marksmanship was excellent. She had seen shooting competitions throughout the North, and Sarah had won most of them. She was the kind of soldier you needed when things got out of control and you had to do something explosively fast. The third was Michael, a fellow of barely 19 who seemed too young for war, but war respected no age groups in the Civil War. Michael had been recruited from a small town near Chicago, but he possessed a quality that made him invaluable. He could see in almost total darkness. He didn't know if it was a natural gift, or the result of working in coal mines since his youth. But the fact was that, while other men stumbled in the darkness, Michael moved as if he had lamps in his eyes. The 4 humans and the mule were now preparing to set off into the unknown, on a mission that probably none of them expected to survive. Williams approached the Gravedigger in those final moments before departure, his steps deliberate and calm. He extended his hand and gave her a firm but gentle pat on the animal's neck, surprised at how warm her skin was under the grayish coat. The mule was mainly bone and skin, but that warmth showed that life still circulated in those veins, that the animal's heart continued to beat, continued to insist on existing despite all evidence to the contrary. The animal slowly turned her good eye toward Williams. The eye that was not clouded by cataracts. The eye that could still see, even if blurred. And in that moment, Williams swore he saw something in that gaze. It was not ordinary animal intelligence, it was understanding. It was a kind of tacit recognition between 2 creatures that had been beaten by life in similar ways and who now understood something fundamental about each other. It was a moment that lasted only 1 or 2 seconds but seemed to contain eternities. "We'll make it, old girl," Williams whispered in a tone only the mule could hear. "We'll make it together." At 9 o'clock in the evening exactly, as the moon was just beginning to rise above the horizon of the landscape, casting long, ghostly shadows over the sand, the small group was lost in the darkness of the Virginia landscape. Williams' fellow officers watched him depart from the camps, their silhouettes becoming smaller as they moved north. In the faces of these officers was a strange mixture of admiration and pity, of respect and certainty that they would never see Captain Thomas Williams alive again. "Goodbye, Captain," some whispered. "Now he's really gone completely mad," said others. "God protect him," prayed the more devout. But the caravan continued on. The old mule trotting slowly. The 4 humans at her side. Disappearing into that night that swallowed everything. That devoured everything, that promised nothing except possibly death. The first 15 miles were the easiest. Although easy was a relative term when speaking of crossing the Virginia landscape at night. The Gravedigger stepped forward slowly, but with a consistency that was almost hypnotic. Her slow gait, that sluggish walk that had seemed pitiful and lamentable in the camp, now proved to be a blessing fallen from heaven. She didn't stir up much dust, she didn't make unnecessary noise. She didn't whinny, didn't snort, didn't do any of the things normal horses did when they were nervous or frightened. The Confederates, accustomed to following men on horseback who galloped desperately in their panicked flights, would not expect to encounter an old mule trotting slowly through the landscape as if it were a Sunday stroll. It was perfect camouflage, though no one had planned it that way. The night of the landscape was dark in a way that city people could never understand. It was not the darkness of cities, where there was still some clarity from lanterns and moons reflected in glass. It was total, absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that existed before man invented fire. Williams rode ahead, his eyes slowly adjusting to the lack of light. He could see just enough to keep his horse on what he hoped was the right path. Behind him, Sergeant Miller led, the Gravedigger by the reins, his huge hand gripping the rope with the familiarity of someone who had spent more than 30 years of his life in the saddle. Lieutenant Sarah rode to the side, her rifle loaded and ready, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, although she couldn't see much in this darkness. And Michael, the 19-year-old fellow, walked in the rear, his almost supernatural ability to see in the darkness keeping him alert for any suspicious movement. Around the 20th mile, when the group was beginning to relax a little, believing they had left the Union camp and its immediate dangers behind, the men heard voices. They were not distant murmurs. They were clear, male voices with the unmistakable accent of Confederate military. A unit was patrolling less than 500 meters away, possibly less. Williams quickly and decisively raised his right hand, a signal he had practiced hundreds of times with his men. The group stopped completely. It was not a gradual breaking. It was a total halt. As if time itself had frozen. The horses stopped walking. The men held their breath. And the Gravedigger, as if understanding with absolute clairvoyance the extreme gravity of the situation, as if processing in her aged and worn mind that one sound, one movement, one wrong breath could mean death for everyone, did not make a single sound. The animal remained so still that the men could almost hear the beats of her heart, that constant and faithful rhythm that had kept the mule alive through a decade of hunger, neglect, and revolutionary violence. The Confederates passed slowly, very slowly. Their horses whinnied constantly, nervous perhaps because of the night air currents of the landscape or simply because of their equine nature. Their boots struck the hard, compacted ground of the landscape, producing a dull, rhythmic sound. You could hear their fragmented conversations. An officer shouted orders. Another soldier complained about the cold, about being so far from camp, about searching for ghosts in the night. But they saw nothing. An old, half-blind mule, loaded with 200 pounds of ammunition that could change the course of an entire battle, was simply not what they were looking for. The Confederates were looking for cavalry, armed men, military units that moved with speed. They were not looking for an animal that could barely walk. As the Confederates moved away, their voices gradually fading in the distance, Captain Williams exhaled deeply. A sound that seemed to carry all the accumulated tension with it. He was the first to breathe deeply after what seemed like an eternity. His men imitated him, though they did so more discreetly, aware that they were not yet out of danger. They continued on. The 30th mile was the place where the terrain became truly treacherous, where geography itself changed from a relatively flat landscape into a labyrinth of ravines and deep cracks. The mental maps that Williams had drawn during weeks of study began to come to life. He knew these ravines were here. He knew it was the only passable way if they wanted to avoid the patrolled routes. But theoretical knowledge and the practical reality of riding blind through such terrain were two completely different things. The ravines were deep, dark, with falls that would have meant instant death for any living creature. A normal horse would have stumbled in the first 5 meters. A normal horse would have fallen, breaking its legs trying to descend these rocky and dangerous slopes. But the Gravedigger, with her good eye carefully assessing each step with the concentration of a surgeon performing an operation, with that other eye clouded by cataracts that somehow still processed some light information, began to descend as if she had known the way for years. Her hooves found footing in places where there seemed to be none. Her muscles, though thin and worn by age, showed a strength and precision that completely contradicted her appearance of a half-dead skeleton. Lieutenant Sarah, a disciplined and brave military woman who had seen 3 years of constant revolutionary action, was visibly frightened. Her youth, which normally made her less cautious than older men, did not protect her from the palpable reality of danger. "Captain, this is too much," she whispered, her voice slightly trembling. "I can't see anything. The horses are scared. If one of them breaks a leg here, we're trapped. We have to find another way." But Williams simply responded with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. "Trust the mule, Lieutenant." And trust was the right thing, though Sarah could not know that at that moment. The Gravedigger continued to traverse those dark ravines with a skill that challenged every biological logic, every veterinary reason. Her slow gait became more cautious, more deliberate, but no less sure. It was as if years of suffering, of walking over impossible terrain, of being beaten by life in ways that men could barely imagine, had taught this mule how to move her body with the precision of an experienced surgeon. At the 40th mile, dangerously approaching Boston, only 20 miles away, though they couldn't see it yet, the group heard gunshots in the distance. A smaller battle between rival units, probably Confederate soldiers facing Union soldiers who had been surprised outside the main camp. The shots were irregular, discontinuous, the kind of fire that indicated close combat without clear coordination. It seemed as if the battle was taking place about 10 miles away. Far enough away but close enough to remind them that violence continued to be the defining characteristic of this region. The Gravedigger was not disturbed in the least. Her objective, if a mule could have conscious objectives, was to continue forward, to reach Boston, to fulfill what her instinct told her she had to do. Nothing would divert her from that path. The animal had been beaten by life in ways that men could barely imagine. It had been left to die when the Confederates retreated. It had wandered through the landscape for days, perhaps weeks, without water or food. It had been mocked, ridiculed, considered a useless animal. And through all of that, it had learned something that humans need a whole lifetime to understand. Quiet persistence. Resistance without boasting, the acceptance of suffering as something that simply had to be endured. That had made the mule practically immune to fear, panic, the impulsive reactions that cause death. The last miles before dawn were psychologically the longest. The group was exhausted. The men's horses showed signs of severe fatigue, their steps becoming less sure, their breathing more labored. But the Gravedigger continued forward with that consistency that Williams now understood as her true strength. She was not fast, but she was reliable. She was not glamorous, but she was effective. It was as if the old mule understood on a cellular level that she carried the hope of hundreds of men on her back, that the supplies she transported could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and mass death. At exactly 60 miles, when the sky was beginning to change from black to navy blue, when the first signs of dawn were beginning to color the eastern horizon, the Gravedigger accelerated her pace almost imperceptibly. It was as if she knew they were close, as if that old mule instinct, that instinct that had kept her alive so many years, told her that safety was in sight. The dawn over Boston was like a divine revelation that came to seal a pact between earth and heaven. The sky went from absolute black to navy blue, then to light blue, and finally to that golden orange that meant the night was over and the eternity of the landscape had loosened its grip. The military men guarding the city were extremely surprised to see a small group of soldiers approaching, led by a captain covered in landscape dust, accompanied by a mule so shabby it barely seemed alive. Her gray coat remained a mess. Her gait remained extremely slow. But there was something else about her now. Something none of the guards could explain. It was as if the Gravedigger carried with her not only material cargo, but historical cargo, as if her old and run-down body were a vessel of pure destiny. "Open the gates," shouted Williams, his voice hoarse from the night's silence. Hoarse from the dust that stuck to his throat. Hoarse from the nervous tension of 60 miles of contained terror. "I bring supplies. I bring what we need to not disappear." The guards who watched the entrance gates to Boston did not know whether they were witnessing a miracle or a hallucination caused by the fatigue of the night shift. A known captain, yes, but only accompanied by 4 people and a mule that seemed more dead than alive. But when they unloaded the mule in the main courtyard, when the soldiers in charge of inventorying supplies began to open the crates, their eyes widened to impossible dimensions. 200 pounds, all intact. All ammunition crates in perfect condition, without a scratch, without a single lost or damaged bullet. The .30 caliber ammunition was perfectly organized in its wooden containers, each aligned as if they had just been manufactured in the factory. All medicines without any damage. Morphine, quinine against malaria, salves for infected wounds, medical herbs, processed according to recipes that had been preserved since colonial times. Everything that could keep men alive who were dying of hunger, thirst, gangrene infections, sepsis and open wounds. The Gravedigger literally collapsed to the ground as soon as they removed the last pound from her destroyed back. Her body shook violently, as if an invisible force were shaking her from within. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, as if her lungs barely had the energy to expand and contract one more time. She had pushed her body beyond her biological limits, as if she knew exactly what was at stake. As if her animal soul had understood on some primitive but deep level that the lives of thousands of men depended on her reaching this precise point of the landscape at this precise moment of dawn. The military doctors rushed to care for the animal, bringing water in wooden buckets, bringing soaked hay for her to eat, bringing blankets to keep her warm. The Gravedigger drank water as if she wanted to empty the entire Hudson River into her stomach. She ate the hay with an almost reverent slowness. Each chewing action seemed like a prayer of thanks to the universe that had kept her alive all these years of suffering. The men who surrounded her began to grasp something their tired spirits could barely process. This old mule. This despised and mocked animal. This creature that had been the object of ridicule for the entire camp, had just completed a mission that would have killed any other known pack animal in the history of war in America. General Franz Fischer, the legendary military man who was the right hand of President Lincoln in matters of strategy and logistics, was informed of the arrival. He came running, literally running like a 20-year-old despite his 52 years, to see with his own eyes what his officers were reporting. The general stopped in front of the Gravedigger and simply stared at her, hands on his hips, slowly shaking his head as if trying to reconcile the reality he saw with what his rational mind told him was possible. Williams approached him, the sticky saliva in his mouth, his eyes practically closed from fatigue, but with a dignity in his bearing that no fatigue could destroy. "Sir General," said Williams, slightly bowing his head in a gesture of military respect. "I have brought the ammunition and medicine we had stored in the Boston depot, 60 miles of night crossing, without losing a single piece, without dropping a single pound." General Fisher continued to contemplate the Gravedigger, as if trying to decipher the secrets of the universe by simply looking at her. Then he slowly approached the mule, lifted her old head from the ground with one hand under her chin, and looked into that good eye that had seen the most important dawn of his life. In that eye the general saw determination. He saw resistance. He saw everything the Civil War pretended to be, condensed in the gaze of an animal that barely had the strength to be alive. "Captain Williams," said General Fisher, his heavy voice resonating like the sound of a distant cannon, "you have made the impossible possible. These supplies will arrive at exactly the right time. President Lincoln will receive a messenger in the next hour. In 5 hours we will carry out the frontal assault we planned, with this ammunition and these medicines. With men strengthened by the hope that someone cares about their survival. With the renewed determination that comes from seeing that leadership believes in you enough to risk everything in a single night, we will attack the Confederate lines, and we will win. Not because we are stronger, not because our rifles are better, but because at this precise moment we have become invincible thanks to something the Confederates will never understand." The general approached the captain and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then he turned again to the Gravedigger and spoke words that would be repeated in the Union camps for the rest of the Civil War. "This mule has just won a battle that hasn't even begun yet. This mule has just changed the course of American history. This mule is now officially part of the glory of the Civil War." In that moment, as the sky completed its transition from night to day, as the first rays of sun began to illuminate the brick rooftops of Boston, as the Union soldiers in their tents began to wake up and feel that something in the air had changed, the Gravedigger closed her good eye. She wasn't exactly sleeping. She was resting in a deeper way. Recovering not only in body but in spirit. Knowing she had fulfilled her mission. In a few hours, this mule would witness a frontal assault that would go down in history as the Battle of Boston, an attack where the Union forces, re-equipped, re-nourished, re-medicated, managed to break the Confederate lines and deliver a blow from which the Confederates would never fully recover. The military men who had mocked the Gravedigger only 12 hours before now approached with almost religious respect. They brought her fresh water from the deepest wells. They brought her the best herbs they could find. They spoke to her in reverent whispers, as if they were in the presence of a sacred being, as if the mule had been touched by the hand of God himself and revealed truths that humans could barely understand. Sergeant Miller, who had accompanied Williams on the crossing, told the story to anyone who would listen, describing how the Gravedigger had descended impossible ravines, how she had remained silent when the Confederates passed meters away, how in the last mile she had imperceptibly accelerated her pace as if she knew she was approaching her destination. Lieutenant Sarah would years later, when the war was over and she was a retired merchant in the city of New York, write a detailed report about that night. In that report, she described with cinematic precision every moment of the crossing, every danger, every small miracle that had accumulated to create a general miracle. She said she believed, honestly believed, that the Gravedigger had possessed a strategic intelligence that surpassed ordinary animal intelligence. She said she was certain the mule had understood the historical significance of her journey, that it had known it was not just transporting a load of ammunition and medicine, but the future of the war itself, condensed in 200 pounds. Michael, the 19-year-old fellow whose ability to see in almost total darkness had been crucial to avoiding the obstacles of the terrain, years later, when he was an old man sitting on a wooden chair in front of his house in Boston, would tell his grandchildren about that night with tears in his eyes. He would tell them that the Gravedigger was the bravest animal he had ever known. He would tell them that sometimes in his dreams he still saw the good eye looking forward, always forward, as if nothing in the universe could stop her advance to save her comrades. Captain Williams would never forget the expression on General Fisher's face. That expression that said he had gone from being a military man evaluating a result to being a witness to something that transcended the military, something that was more fundamental, something that touched the spiritual. Williams knew he had bet his career, possibly his life, on a mule that no one believed could make the journey. And that mule had proven that men's contempt, their disbelief, their inability to see beyond the superficial, meant nothing when faced with the presence of a will that simply refused to be broken. The Gravedigger had taught all those men in that magical dawn of 1863. A lesson that American history would never forget. That true worth does not lie in strength, does not lie in youth, does not lie in appearance or physical health, but in the pure, raw and naked ability to keep going despite everything. The news of the arrival of supplies spread through the Boston camp like lightning through a stormy sky. Soldiers who only a few hours before had lost hope, who had mentally resigned themselves to the idea of a shameful defeat, now rose with eyes shining with renewed faith. The Union generals gathered in the main tent around a dusty map of the terrain surrounding the city. General Catherine Weber, a woman with mustaches so thick they seemed to have a life of their own, could hardly believe what she heard when Williams reported the completion of the mission. 60 miles? She asked over and over, as if the number were too absurd to process. With that old mule we all saw in the camp? Williams nodded, completely indifferent to the amazement of his superiors. His uniform was destroyed, his face burned by the sun of the landscape, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. But his presence radiated a calm that was contagious, a certainty that fatigue could not erode. With exactly that old mule, madam, he replied. And it arrived without a single lost bullet, without a single broken medicine bottle. President Lincoln personally came out to see the Gravedigger, who lay on the ground breathing so shallowly that the spectators almost believed she was dead. The legendary ruler, whose reputation was built on acts of military cunning and battlefield hardness, knelt in the dust next to the animal. His hands, huge and calloused, gently touched the animal's neck with a tenderness that no one had shown him in years with anything. This mule, Lincoln said quietly, but loud enough for his generals to hear, is worth more than 100 men riding the best horses from Kentucky. The military doctors worked all morning to stabilize the Gravedigger. They gave her water slowly, drop by drop, fearing that her dehydrated body could not process it too quickly. They laid her on an improvised bed of hay, the only available softness in the entire camp. And then they did something extraordinary. They used part of that morphine that the mule had transported, the same medicine for which life had been risked, to relieve the animal's pain. The Gravedigger opened her good eye and seemed to look directly at Williams, who watched from the entrance of the medical tent. In that gaze was a recognition that transcended the barriers between species, between the animal and the human. It was the recognition of two beings who had suffered, who had been underestimated by others, who had found in each other something that could not be explained with words but could only be felt in the deepest part of the soul. If you enjoyed this incredible story of courage and determination, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this amazing tale with your friends and let us know in the comments what you thought about the Gravedigger's heroic journey. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified of our next incredible historical stories. The battle preparation began immediately after the supplies arrived. The ammunition was distributed among the soldiers with military precision, each man receiving exactly what he needed for the assault that would take place at noon. The medicines were taken to the field hospital, where doctors began immediately treating the men who had been suffering from infections and wounds that had seemed incurable just hours before. The morphine brought relief to soldiers who had been screaming in pain for days. The quinine began to combat the malaria that had weakened entire companies. The antibiotics, primitive but effective, began their work against the infections that had been slowly killing men who should have been fighting. But more important than the material supplies was what the Gravedigger had brought in spiritual terms. The story of her journey spread from soldier to soldier like wildfire. Men who had been on the verge of despair began to believe again. If an old, half-blind mule could accomplish the impossible, then maybe they could too. If a creature that had been left for dead could find the strength to carry the hope of an entire army 60 miles through enemy territory, then maybe there was still a chance for victory. The transformation in the camp was visible and immediate. Soldiers who had been lying in their tents, too weak and demoralized to even clean their weapons, now stood up and began preparing for battle with an energy that seemed to come from nowhere. The officers, who had been discussing surrender just the day before, now gathered around maps plotting the assault with the enthusiasm of men who believed they could win. The field cooks, who had been rationing the last scraps of food, now began preparing a proper meal with the provisions that had arrived with the medical supplies. Captain Williams found himself at the center of attention he had never sought. Officers who had mocked his plan now approached him asking for details of the journey. How had he known the mule could make it? How had he navigated the Confederate patrols? How had he found the strength to believe when everyone else had given up? Williams answered their questions simply and directly, but always returned the credit to the Gravedigger. She knew what had to be done, he would say. She understood better than any of us what was at stake. The mule herself remained in the medical tent, slowly recovering from the ordeal. The veterinary surgeon, Dr. Johnson, a man who had treated hundreds of military animals over the course of the war, said he had never seen anything like the Gravedigger's condition. By all medical logic, he told General Fisher, this animal should have died months ago. Her body shows signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and exhaustion that would have killed a younger, stronger animal. But somehow, she found the will to not only survive but to perform one of the most demanding physical feats I've ever witnessed in an animal. As noon approached, the time set for the assault, the entire camp buzzed with activity. Soldiers checked their weapons one final time, loaded with the ammunition the Gravedigger had brought. Officers reviewed their battle plans, confident now that they had the resources to execute them properly. The field surgeons prepared their stations with the medicines that would allow them to save lives that would have been lost without proper treatment. General Fisher stood before his assembled troops, the Gravedigger's empty supply crates visible behind him as a reminder of what had made this moment possible. His voice carried across the field as he addressed the men who would soon march into battle. "Soldiers of the Union Army," he began, "today we fight not just for victory, but for the spirit of determination that brought us to this moment. Last night, while we slept, 4 brave souls and 1 extraordinary animal crossed 60 miles of enemy territory to bring us what we needed to survive. They succeeded not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they refused to accept defeat." He gestured toward the medical tent where the Gravedigger rested. "That mule, whom many of you mocked yesterday, has shown us what true courage looks like. She has shown us that victory comes not to those who never fall, but to those who get up every time they're knocked down. She has shown us that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who change the course of history." The general's words were met with cheers from the assembled soldiers, but also with a respectful silence as many of them turned to look toward the tent where their unlikely savior rested. Some of the men, tough veterans who had seen years of war and death, wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply stood straighter, feeling the weight of the example they had been given. At exactly noon, as the sun reached its zenith over the Virginia landscape, the Union assault began. The soldiers, well-fed, well-armed, and spiritually renewed, charged the Confederate lines with a ferocity that caught their enemies completely off guard. The Confederates, who had been expecting to face a weakened, demoralized force, instead, found themselves confronting an army that fought as if inspired by something beyond mere military duty. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when the dust finally settled, the Union forces had achieved a decisive victory. The Confederate siege was broken, their lines scattered, and their retreat turned into a rout. It was exactly the kind of victory that changes the momentum of an entire war, the kind that historians would later point to as a turning point in the conflict. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the events leading up to the battle, the real victory had occurred the night before, when an old mule named the Gravedigger had carried 200 pounds of hope across 60 miles of impossible terrain. They understood that wars are not won solely by grand strategies or superior weapons, but sometimes by small acts of extraordinary courage performed by the most unlikely heroes. As the celebration of victory began in the camp, Williams made his way to the medical tent where the Gravedigger still rested. The old mule opened her good eye as he approached, and for a moment, the two of them simply regarded each other in silence. There was no need for words between them. They had shared something that transcended the ordinary relationships between humans and animals, something that belonged to the realm of legend and myth. Years later, when the Civil War had ended and peace had returned to the nation, historians would write detailed accounts of the Battle of Boston and the events that made it possible. They would analyze the tactics, study the troop movements, and debate the strategic implications. But those who had been there knew that the real story was simpler and more profound than any military analysis could capture. It was the story of an old mule who refused to give up, who carried the hopes of an army on her back, and who proved that sometimes the most broken among us are the ones capable of the greatest acts of heroism. It was the story of how determination and will can overcome seemingly impossible odds, and how true courage often comes in the most unexpected forms. The Gravedigger lived for 3 more years after the Battle of Boston, cared for with the respect and honor due to a war hero. When she finally died, peacefully in her sleep in a field outside the city, she was given a military funeral attended by hundreds of soldiers who had served in that campaign. A monument was erected in her honor, with an inscription that read simply, "The Gravedigger. She carried hope when no one else could." And if you found this incredible true story as moving as we did, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more amazing tales from history. Share this story with anyone who needs to be reminded that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won by those who simply refuse to give up. Leave a comment below telling us about a time when you or someone you know overcame impossible odds. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our inspiring historical content. The legacy of that night lived on in the memories of all who witnessed it, a reminder that in the darkest hours, when all seems lost, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes it takes the form of an old mule with one good eye and a heart that refused to stop beating, carrying precious cargo through the darkness toward the dawn of a new day.